Did I see a familiar face back here? Is that you, Rose? How, I am so well. How are you? You're in a good place. Rose was at Foundry, where I pastored for how many years, Rose?
I was there about 25 years.
25 years. I was there 34. Nobody else wanted me. They spared me the pain. They spared all the congregations like yours the pain of me coming. So, no, I served at Foundry for 34 years and then a total of 46 years in the pastorate. I started very young at 18. But back after Harvey, the bishop called and said, I think it's time for you to speed up your succession plan because I need help to run the Harvey recovery program. I'd already started well, that's a story in its own, a nonprofit back in 2010 to make life better for kids in Cy-Fair. It's called Cy-Hope. You see, during my 34 years, actually during my 46 years of ministry here in the U.S., I had come to this country as a missionary and a missionary kid. Let me tell you that story. I was born in Brazil, and my parents were refugees, or had been refugees from the Soviet Union, German Mennonites that got caught behind the revolution, the Iron Curtain. And so in 1929, my father's dad was able to acquire a visa to get out because he was a member of the party, the Communist Party. And the reason he was a member of that party is because one day he's working in a mill and the Red Army came through. They needed a medic and they said, hey, I understand you're the town firefighter and that splices people's broken bones. He said, yeah. He said, well, come with us. And so he was drafted into the Red Army. But it gave him a chance to apply for a visa. In 1929, he went to Moscow with my grandmother and my father and his sister. They waited for months, got a visa, and ended up in Germany as refugees, waiting for some country to take them in. At the same time, my mother, who was born in Omsk, Siberia, her dad was a mayor of a town there, a small little village. But he was put into jail because somebody he had written a reference for had not performed well at the job, and so they blamed him and put him. How would you like to go to jail anytime somebody you give a reference to messes up, right? So he ended up in jail. As it turned out, he was on Stalin's purge list. Every week, Stalin would send every territory a list, a purging list. He felt that it was good for the country to purge. He didn't care who was killed as long as enough people were killed to purge the land. And so it turned out that he was among the enemies of Stalin, supposedly, and he was slated to be killed. But he was already in jail. His friend was a jailer, and it was one of his children's birthday, and so he asked if he could have a day off to go to the party, and he would be back the next day. And because the jailer was his friend, he said, okay, but you better come back. Well, when he arrived home, my grandmother had packed everything, sold whatever she could, packed up the rest, and she said, we're leaving tonight. Well, they weren't able to go that night, and so they were going to go the next morning. But by then, because he didn't show up back in jail, everything was shut down. They were looking for him. They hid out until they found a barge that carried grain, a river barge, and they hitched a ride with this captain as he transported grain downriver. And it was about a 3-day journey to the next city. And so after day one, all of a sudden, the barge got hung up on a sandbar, and they couldn't get free for 3 days. They waited for somebody to come and pull them out. Well, a captain with another ship finally came by, saw him, and threw him a lifeline. But he said, you're not really grounded. There's no barge here. There's no sandbar here. He said, but I haven't been able to move. He said, but you're free. And sure enough, he was able to sail on. When they get to the next city, my grandfather went to the train station to buy a ticket to Moscow. And the man said to him, it's a good thing you didn't come yesterday or the because for 3 days the police have been here looking for somebody, and no tickets were being sold. Can we say legacy awaits? Can we say providence at work? Well, as it happened, my grandparents on both sides, along with tens of thousands, if not millions, of other German Mennonites from the Soviet Union were there in Germany as refugees. So, my relatives have been refugees twice. Be kind to refugees. Jesus was one, by the way. He was a refugee for 4 years in Egypt, was he not? Fleeing Herod. And so we ended up in Brazil because the United States said they had no room, Canada as well, and so we ended up in Brazil, and my family was given land, and all of them were given land to grow, 40 acres with which to earn a living, and they carved out beautiful farms out of the jungle. But then in 1953, the year I was born, my dad got a call to go into mission work. Started off in an orphanage as directors, 2 couples in charge of 77 children, 0 to 18. My parents had all the boys, plus 5 children of their own. So I always hated when my dad disciplined any of those boys because I would get it from the boy later. But so I grew up in an orphanage for the first 5 years of my life. And eventually, when I was entering junior high, my father was given a transfer and told, we want you to move to Ecuador and work in Christian broadcasting in a global broadcasting program there in German for the world. And so we immigrated to Ecuador and left my relatives behind. I haven't seen those 51 cousins that I have in Brazil ever since 1960, 64. And so never saw them again, made a new life. My parents thought my future would be in North America, so they put us in an American school, Christian school, and there I learned English. But also there, God gave me a calling for mission work. Towards the end of our junior year, we started a club to help sell New Testaments and pass out literature and help folks in the marketplace. And we discovered this one large marketplace in Quito, the capital, did not have a church. And so we thought, well, let's just borrow the school loudspeaker. You bring your guitar, I'll preach, and we'll do church every Sunday morning here. We found a little store that had an empty room above, and we set the loudspeakers out, not in, so people in the marketplace could hear. And a couple of folks would sing until a crowd would show up, and then I would preach. And we started that. And eventually, by our senior year, we were running, we filled up the room and had a bunch of people sitting downstairs every Sunday waiting for us and doing church that way. And when we graduated from high school, my dad gave me $90 and said, son, go to America, find a school, and make a life for yourself. I'd never been here. None of us had. And so I took off. I found out later from my father that within a couple of months, some folks had come to the mission station and said, where are pastors? What pastors? Well, you sent some pastors over to start a church, and now they're gone. We need a pastor. Where are they? And then my parents and the other missionaries realized, could that be what our kids were doing? And I said, well, Dad, what happened to that church? He said, it's the largest congregation in Quito today, and they run over 1,000 people in worship. And I learned early on, you don't start ministry. If you're waiting to finish seminary to start your ministry, it's too late, because by then you're jaded. Because seminary often is a cemetery. Because you get into all this head stuff and the institutional things. Everything that Jesus wasn't. Well, I ended up in college. My first day in America was a Saturday. I came to Kokomo by Monday morning at noon. I already had my Social Security card, a green card, and 2 jobs. Yes, I had the Mennonite work ethic and I got after things. But I also realized that it was only because of what family I'd been born into. It was no doing of mine. If my parents had come from the Philippines and looked differently, or from Nigeria and looked differently, or from Brazil and were among the indigent from Brazil, the doors that were open to me would not have been open to me. And so I've never forgotten, because my first week in North America, my introduction to this country was 1971, Kokomo, Indiana, during the race riots. I was coming out of our Scotty's hamburger joint where I flipped burgers, and I turned out of the alley to go this way, and a gang of white kids were coming with pipes and chains this way, and I thought, oh, kind of reminiscent of Ecuador. A coup must be going on. I turned this way, and there was a group of black kids. I said, uh-oh. And I turned around, walked away. That was my introduction to this country. And I've never figured out, that if God made us all unique, why does skin color matter any more than hair color? Not to God, it doesn't. And so I've wrestled with things. But if I did go to seminary and became a pastor, and I bought the Kool-Aid that the key is to build a great big church and to build buildings and to have programs and to get as many people in the seats of the church, and get as much money as we can. And we had some great things and we did some good things, but I was wrong, because I thought forever that the most important thing that happens anywhere is what happens at church. And after decades of that kind of ministry and the stress of sustaining an insatiable appetite from an infrastructure where, you know what I felt guilty about one day? I woke up in the middle of the night. I couldn't sleep anymore because I was worried about making payroll. And the Holy Spirit asked me, have you ever been up at night because somebody's hurting or because somebody's lost? But you're awake because you're afraid to make payroll. What has happened to my church is what I heard God say. And I realized that God had called me to be a missionary, not a CEO of a church. I had built a church from 100 members to 5,000. We had 2 campuses, 3 venues, having 7 services every Sunday. And I thought that was my legacy. And God made it clear to me, said, that's not a legacy that I'm proud of necessarily. And so we began to search our souls, and our church made a shift from being an internally focused church to an externally focused church. I think Wesley's kind of there, because my first experience with you was after Rita. Did Rita come through here? Yeah, I slept in that building over there to help and work with your folks. And I saw the Army teams that you hosted yesterday. And and you were here yesterday when we were at the meeting, when we were talking about getting ready for whatever disaster is coming. And so I've always had this appreciation and affinity to Wesley. And I was so pleased when I was asked to preach, because I do believe that this church has some good DNA and that you are externally focused. And so we shifted our church. In 2010, we were getting ready to open up a new campus, and they had to pay for it. We did a massive fundraising campaign, but we said, God, the first $1 million is going to go to anybody but those who are in the church. And we started Sci-Hope with $1 million to make life better for kids in Sci-Fair, because we're the 3rd largest school district in Texas, 120,000 students. More than half of them are economically at risk. We have a huge number of kids on free lunches. Do you know how poor you have to be on a free lunch? A family of 4 making less than $22,000 a year to qualify for a free lunch. I thought, oh my goodness, how can you survive in this society? My parents never made more than $18,000 a year, but it's a different world where they grew up. And so we began to make life better for kids through counseling and mentoring and sports programs and feeding 1,500 families that don't have food over the weekend. And one of the great stories I see is with this feeding backpack program is that every Friday the kids who qualified would pick up a backpack at school and take home a backpack full of food to feed a family that weekend. Again, these are families that make less than $20,000 a year for the entire family. And so, because I'd overheard during one of our community egg hunts, I'd overheard two mamas speaking, didn't know I spoke Spanish. And one of them said, so after the egg hunt, so do you have anything to feed your kids? And the other mother said, no, but we got candy. And so we got a call from a counselor one day saying, hey, there's this young man at school. I got to tell you his story. I sent the backpack feeding program sheet over to his house and asked that his mother sign it and send it back, that she would receive food. And how's it work? She explained that on Friday after school, he picks up the backpack and brings it back on Monday. Now, Fridays and Mondays are the highest attended days of school that week. Cool, huh? And he said, nobody never done nothing for me, and I don't believe it. He was sullen, never spoke unless he was spoken to, and the teacher said when he answered her, he'd do it with grunts. He was sullen. Well, he took it home. And he brought it back with a signature on Monday, and he said, I still don't think it's for real. I don't believe it. And she said, well, just come to the library at the end of school, and you'll get your backpack. And you're number 2. Look for tag number 2. And he said, okay. The librarian said when he came to pick up his first backpack, he saw them all lined up against the wall. And he ran to look for number 2. And he put on that backpack and rushed to the school bus. And then he came back Monday a different child. He had taken an old T-shirt and a big old fat magic marker and written a big number 2. And that's what he wore to school that day. Chokes you up, doesn't it? That's what we decided would be our legacy. And so ever since, I've been devoting my life towards not building buildings. Nothing wrong with that. But when it becomes about that, it means when it's just an end to itself rather than a means to a glorious end, there is something wrong with that, right? And so I've been working so hard to repair my legacy before God. And one of the chapters in the Bible that changed my life, one of the things, and I want to recommend, do this. I've known Jesus since I was born. I mean, I grew up at devotions at Jesus' knee with my father giving devotions, okay? But I realized one day I didn't know Jesus, and the day was when I read Matthew in one sitting. If you read it by chapters, you cannot understand the message of any of the Bible verses, because we as preachers are enormously guilty of preaching out of context. And I'd done it all my life, just taking clips and things and creating modern messages, feel-good messages. Come to me all who labor and are heavy laden, I'll give you rest. Has nothing to do with me suffering or me having a bad back or being tired. It has to do all about the oppression of the religious establishment that put a huge weight of demands upon the people, religious demands, 1,500 ways to break one commandment of the Sabbath. All these do's and don'ts, and Jesus said it's not about that. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. Come to me all who are burdened and heavy laden. I'll give you rest. From what? From all of this oppressive religious stuff. I only have 2 commandments. I don't need 1,500 rules for how to break the Sabbath. I'm going to tell you right now, the only commandments are this: love God and love your neighbor. And you can't do one without doing the other. We can't worship God if we hate our neighbor. If we're not in love with our neighbor, we can't claim we love God, and vice versa. And so I had my own reformation. I came to Jesus, having preached him for decades. And I learned. Read Matthew in one sitting, the best discipleship manual ever made. And I realized that if you don't get Matthew 1:3, I think it is, No, Matthew 5:3, right? Forget the rest. The very first beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit. And until we get that right, nothing else will ever work. And God can't do anything for us. It all builds from that foundation up. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And when we become poor in spirit and open to God, all things happen. And God gives us a life of calling. And He gives us a legacy. The other life-changing thing that I went through was when I found Isaiah 58. God tells Isaiah, I've got a message. I got a bone to pick with my people. So he says in verse 1, shall we put it on the screen? He says this, declare to my people their rebellion and to the house of Jacob their sins. It's interesting, the house of Jacob. It's kind of like your moms when you call your children by their first and last name, first and middle name. They're in trouble. Because every time God was pleased with Israel, He called them the house of Israel. Because Israel is the same guy as Jacob after he was right with God. But now it's back to Jacob, the house of Jacob. Because Jacob means swindler, deceiver. Tell them I've got a bone to pick, and don't be shy about it. Shout it with from the top of your voice. In verse 2, day after day they seek me out, eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commandments of its God. What do you mean we haven't? We observe the Sabbaths. We keep all those 10 commandments. We observe all of that. What have we done wrong? We go to church. We fast and we pray. What else do you want from us, God? And God says, verse 3, they ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they said, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? It's like that time when I was going through a bad time and I wanted God to do more for me and help me out better. And I said, God, no wonder you have so few servants when you treat us the way you do. But you know, God's never offended. He'd rather we engage. Be hot or cold, engage God. In our joy, in our sadness, in our anger, in our exuberance, whatever, engage God and have a real relationship. You can say anything to God. He's a father. Would you parents be mad at your toddler when they get hurt and they blame you and say, I hate you. You didn't stop me from falling off the bike. Are you offended? No. We take them, we love them. We kiss them better. So they're crying out to God, man, what else? What do you want from us, God? We already do this. I go to church every Sunday. I tithe. I do this. So God says in verse 3, yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other, and you cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. It all has to do with how you treat the strangers among you. Not only strangers, but your employees and others. And God lays it out to them, verse 6. Read this. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not turn away from your own flesh and blood? Do away with the yoke of oppression and with the pointing of the finger and the malicious talk, and spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and the poor. And if you do, God promises, then your light will break forth as the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Going to cover your backside is what He's going to do if we do what He says. And if we wonder what's wrong with the world and what's wrong with our country, we can be self-righteous about, well, we work. You know what? I don't think God's ever been truly pleased with us. He's still waiting for us to come around and to do it His way. In my office, I have a painting. And that painting, by the way, reminds me of what happened not long ago when on Wednesday morning, men's luncheon, the leader didn't get there in time. We have a rule, no politics during church time and church lunches and events. But the leader got there late, and they were in the middle of a conversation about immigration. And as the leader walks in, one of our pillars of the church, as far as the institution, was overheard saying, "I don't care what Jesus said or thinks. I say line them up and shoot them all." In the church. Wow. I have that picture in my office. I have a picture of all the people that have made a huge difference in my life. I have Bonhoeffer, Victor Hugo, because the greatest literature outside the Bible is Les Mis, right? I have it memorized. I've seen 13 productions of it around the world. Now, I'd give $1,000 to see it this afternoon if it were here. It's life-changing. I have Mandela and Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, who all paid such a huge price to bring freedom to their people. I have Witold Pilecki, a Polish farmer who back in 1941 had 3 elementary-age kids, but he joined the underground resistance against Hitler. And when they found out about Auschwitz, they wanted to find out if the rumors were real, and he volunteered to be arrested and go to Auschwitz. And they took him there. For 2.5 years, he suffered gruesomely until he found a way to escape. And when he did, he brought all the documentation that was necessary that was brought to Churchill's desk. He's a hero of mine. You know, and there's so many, and Bonhoeffer and so many others. But behind me is a landscape, a picture of a cathedral in Rio de Janeiro. I got there when I went for the World Cup. It's called the Cathedral of the Candelabra, but it's also called the Cathedral of the Massacre of the Children. Back in the 90s, when the church there finally decided that they too wanted to be a Christian church and not just an institutional church, they opened up their doors to the 12 and 13-year-old thugs that rule the streets of Rio, and they began to feed them and educate them and mentor them and find opportunities for them to make a life of themselves. And these kids fell in love with their church and with the people. But one day, and they would sleep on the benches around the church every night. And they said they were guarding the church. One day, one of the kids threw a rock and broke a windshield of a cop car. It's a 12-year-old kid. And that night, the cop came back with his buddies and opened fire and slaughtered 11 of them, injuring many others. And the cop was asked, "Why did you do it?" He said, "I'm cleaning up the streets. We're restoring the streets." It's not what Isaiah says. It's not how we do it. Not through violence, but through love. And I keep that there to remind me how fast well-intended people can fall from grace and be the enemy of Christ and the gospel. There's a picture that won the Pulitzer Prize back in the 90s, 94. Can we put it up? Do you remember seeing this picture at one time? Isn't it horrible? This was in Sudan, 94. A photographer had gone there to document the starvation going on in Sudan. And this is a picture of a starving child trying to crawl to the feeding line. Still a good ways away. Had no one to carry him. And you see what's behind him waiting for his meal. And that picture gripped the world. He got a Pulitzer Prize. And it changed the world's response to Sudan. There was a press conference to talk about about his award. and they talked about, how did you capture it? How did you frame it? What's, all the technology. They were so interested. How did you get this picture? And he explained that it took 20 minutes to frame it and to get it just right. And then somebody in the back of the room asked, "What happened to the child?" And he became quiet and he hung his head and he said, "I don't know. I don't know." He said, "Well, did he get food? Did somebody come get him?" "I don't know." "Well, what do you know?" "Well, I knew I had a job to do, so I went to look for my next picture to document so the world would know what's happening." Well, what he did haunted him. And when he went back to South Africa, his home, one Saturday afternoon, he got in his car, drove to a park where he had played as a child, and there he took out a hose and put it in the tailpipe and the other end into the car and closed the windows until he breathed his last. And he left a note. "I'm really, really sorry. The pain of life overrides the joy to the point that joy does not exist." When we work on the wrong legacy, there is no satisfaction. Only the legacy of that child mattered. Yes, the picture did some great things, accomplished, it rallied the world. But Jesus is asking, but what about that child? Probably could have done both, couldn't he? Help the child to find somebody and then go take your picture. But isn't that what the church does so often? So busy about the important things of life. And I, as a pastor, I don't know how many times I didn't have time to go sit with somebody because I had important work to do. There are times I couldn't even help an older woman change a tire on Sunday morning because I had to go preach. Later, Jesus said, "Yeah, I kind of talked about a parable about that because you had to go teach a Bible study. How is this any different?" Let me close with this story. Handel's Messiah is one of our favorite, right? It's not Christmas until I listen to Handel's Messiah on Christmas afternoon. And but here's the story of it. He probably was, Handel probably was bipolar, and he was in deep depression and deeply in debt. For 30 years, he had been languishing now, and he was getting older. And he thought that he was going to spend the rest of his life in debtor's prison. And so he got an invitation one day from Duke of Devonshire, inviting him to the Irish capital of Dublin to produce a series of benefit concerts for the prisoners at the city jail, as well as for the charitable infirmary at the Inns of Quay. And he said, "Yeah, but I don't have anything to give them." At the same time, he got a second envelope from an old friend, an Englishman called Charles Jennens. He opened a letter and found nothing but lyrics from nothing but words out of the Old and New Testament. Verses, bunch of them. And he began to read these, and suddenly it started internalizing, and he saw the majesty and the power, and God was speaking to him. And as he read these verses, music started coming to his mind. And he sat down, and in 7 days he wrote the first act. Can we talk about having a manic moment here? Another 9 days he finished with a second movement. One more week and he finished with a third, and that great movement about the kingship of Jesus. You know why I think Messiah has endured? It's not because it's the best music. I think there's actually better music than the Messiah. Am I right? There's some pretty good music out there. But the reason Messiah has endured, I think, is because God blessed it for a real reason. When Handel died, well, first of all, the first presentation of Handel's Messiah was a benefit concert, and Handel got nothing for it. And when he died, he left the score of Messiah to a public hospital where it supported the care of the poor for the sick. And Charles Burney, the 18th century music historian, remarked that Handel's Messiah fed the hungry, clothed the naked, and fostered the orphans. No wonder God blessed it. And what a legacy. Now, we want to give him the legacy of creating this inspirational music, but Handel would say to us, no, my legacy was what that music did for the last and the least and the lost. What is your legacy? My legacy is, as I work now in disaster and helping restore lives, is what it says in verse 12. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up old foundations. You will be called repairers of broken walls and restorers of streets that have dwellings in them. That's what my life is about now. Restoring whatever I can restore. Amen.